Hello and welcome back to the Inclusive Teacher Co podcast, everyone. My name is Steph Beatty. I'm an ex-English teacher. I'm a neurodiversity and literacy specialist, neurodiversity trainer, entrepreneur, author, speaker, dog mum, champagne lover, camper van lover. The list goes on, but I'm also somebody who spends a lot of time working with educators, parents, and neurodivergent children and individuals, trying to make sense of a system that often does a spectacularly bad job of making sense of them. So if you are a parent, a teacher, somebody working in education, somebody with a neurodivergent diagnosis, whether that's official, self-identified, or formed in your own head, or something you're still piecing together at 2 a.m. after falling down a research rabbit hole, you're very welcome here. Today, I want to talk about labels, because people get, in my opinion, a bit dramatic when it comes to labels, guys. They act like the minute you say ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, Tourette's, or what have you, suddenly you have a cursed child, or you've cursed a child for life and branded them with some sort of educational forehead tattoo. And honestly, I think it's a load of rubbish. Not all of it, though, because I want to acknowledge that I know it does come from a real fear. Some of it comes from bad experiences. Some of it comes from stigma. Some of it comes from ignorance. And of course, some people don't want their child to be seen as different. And I get that too. So I do get a bit flippant about it sometimes, but I know where it comes from. And I think we need to have, if I'm being honest, a much more honest conversation about this. Because in my view, the label itself isn't the issue. It's what people think about the label and what that label means. And those two things aren't the same. So today I want to get into it. I want to talk about why people resist labels, why labels can actually matter a lot, why diagnosis can be a huge relief rather than some terrible burden, and why I prefer the mantra of explanation over excuse, and why, if we're serious about supporting neurodivergent adults and children, we need to stop acting like understanding somebody properly is somehow a bad thing. And if you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you subscribe, leave a comment or a review, and share it with somebody who needs more help. And I would like you to help people find this podcast, because there is enough nonsense online already. We may as well add something useful, I hope. But let's get into it. So let's start with why people hate labels so much. Why do people get twitchy about labels? Usually it's because they don't want themselves or their child to be put in a box, categorized, treated differently, looked down on, judged, pitied as well, maybe underestimated. And I think that's fair enough. I get it. I think if the world has shown you that a label leads to this lower expectation or weird looks, patronizing comments or stupid stereotypes or being treated like you're broken, then of course you're going to be wary of labels. Of course you are. It goes without saying. But for a lot of people, the word label doesn't feel neutral. It feels very loaded. It feels like, brilliant, now my child's going to be seen as naughty or weird. And I've heard that a lot in schools, and I hear that a lot now working with a lot of educators and parents. I also hear people who have a late diagnosis thinking, oh, great, like now people are going to think I'm incapable. And a lot of people don't put on job application forms or all the likes that they have a diagnosis because they don't want it to go against them for that particular job or whatever. Or they think, great, another reason for someone to decide that I'm too much, I'm too difficult, I'm too disorganized, I'm too flaky, I'm too emotional, or I'm too weird. And, I speak to a late diagnosed friend of mine recently about just this, about this being too much. And that fear is quite real. And I have to say, I have experienced some of these fears myself with putting myself out there online and saying, yes, I have ADHD. It was very much, what are people going to think of me? Am I going to lose business because of this? Is it going to diminish any potential business opportunities or academic opportunities, speaker opportunities, job opportunities, or whatever? So that I get it, and that fear is real. But the problem is people often blame the label for what's actually the fault of ignorance. And this is where I part ways with the anti-label crowd a little bit, because I don't think the label is what damages people. I think the misunderstanding is what can be damaging, or that stigma, or the lazy stereotypes, or the uninformed professionals. There's also schools and systems that cannot see past behaviour damage people as well. But naming something accurately, that isn't automatically harmful because, well, in fact, I think a lot of the time it's the beginning of things that finally make sense. And that's what's getting missed. So people say, I don't want my child to have a label. Okay, what's the alternative? And I'm playing devil's advocate a lot here because I understand two sides, but what's the alternative if they don't have a label? Are they going to be misunderstood, punished, shamed, called lazy, called naughty, dramatic, difficult, sensitive, unfocused, inconsistent? Because they are labels too, by the way. People act like they're avoiding labels when they're actually just swapping a clinical or a descriptive label for a moral one. And I know which one I'd rather have. I'd rather somebody says this child has ADHD than this child is lazy or this child is naughty. I'd rather somebody says this woman is autistic and has spent years masking her autism rather than she's rude, she's awkward, she's overly intense, she needs to loosen up. I'd rather somebody says this person has dyslexia rather than they're stupid, they're rubbish at spelling. So let's not pretend here that no label means no judgment, because sometimes it means the wrong judgment wins. And these are things that I've heard, like terrible things that I've heard, genuinely terrible things that I've heard as an educator, but also as a neurodivergent person myself in conversations with other people who don't understand it. ADHD. So let's have a little look at ADHD now, because honestly, the misunderstandings, the misconceptions about ADHD are freaking wild. You would think by now that people would have moved on from this old school nonsense, but no. Somehow in 2026, people hear ADHD and they think, naughty boy is bouncing off the walls, no discipline, bad parents, attention seeker, lazy, disruptive, not academic, need to try harder. Back in my day, honestly, if I had a quid for every back in my day I've read on comments on social media posts about AD, I wouldn't have to buy houses. I'd be rich already. Because there's an absolute mess of understanding and it's really gets to me, it grinds my gears. So when parents resist the label, I think a lot of the time they're not actually resisting the actual condition. They're resisting what they have been taught that the word ADHD means, because there's a lot of shame and stigma attached to it. They're resisting the fear that if their child has that label, other people are going to treat them like they are less than, less intelligent, less capable, less worthy. And I think that's what parents are scared of. And I do know there are a lot of parents who don't want to tell their child they have ADHD because of the stigma. And again, I get it. There's a fear there, because if the adults around you are uninformed, the label can feel like handing them like ammunition. But the issue is this: if a child has ADHD, it's there whether you name it or not. The label didn't create it. The label just gives you a language for it, and a language that matters, because when you have language, you can start to understand. Once you start to understand, you can start to research it. When you start to research it, you can start to adjust. And when you start to adjust, you can stop responding to neurology as if it's some sort of personality flaw. Okay. And we can stop blaming, but we can also stop excuses, because I always go with the mantra explanation over excuse, and we have to see, what we can put in place to develop ourselves. But anyway, that's another topic, I'm sure. But I think, and in my opinion, everyone's got their own opinions on labels. I think without the label or without that understanding, people often moralize things that are neurological. Okay, so ADHD is a high emotional load. It is neurological. It's not a behavioral choice. Okay, we have to get that out of our heads that it is a choice, because it absolutely isn't. So instead of seeing regulation difficulty or any sort of dysregulation, impulsivity, variable attention, working memory struggles, time blindness, analysis paralysis or task paralysis, or any sort of emotional dysregulation, they see laziness, they see defiance, they see lack of effort. And I think that's the problem. It's not the label, it's the ignorance around the label. So for so many children, no matter what their academic ability, even bright children, especially girls, children who are trying really hard and still getting misunderstood, that label can be a relief. I know that a lot of women who are late diagnosed say, why wasn't this picked up earlier? Why wasn't I told about this earlier? And that label is a massive relief for people because somebody is saying, actually, you're not broken. No, this is the reason this feels harder. This is why you aren't thinking like everybody else. This is why sometimes you struggle to do ABC, because other people can do ABC and you're struggling to do ABC. It's because you don't think like everybody else. Okay. We can work with it. There's a pattern. You're not broken. You're not imagining it. And that's what matters. But children build identity from the feedback they get over time. And if you think of a neurodivergent child, not just ADHD, especially in school, and I say this to teachers I train all the time, those children are constantly being corrected. Now, I'm thinking about this from a secondary level. Okay, we've done little experiments where we've shadowed these children and we hear the corrective comments based on how they should behave in school. And they are so much more corrected than their neurotypical peers. They are so much more corrected than anybody else because they're not doing what every other child's doing. And that's because they don't always think like every other child. I've had teachers say things, and I'm guilty of this myself, so please don't think I'm some sort of like martyr, because I'm really not. But come on, you need to try harder. You're just being lazy. Why don't you just do it? You're bright when you need to be. You need to apply yourself. And then what starts to happen? They think there's something wrong with them. It's effort based. It's the issue is with them as a parent, and I think that's more dangerous than a diagnosis. Now, explanation over excuse. This is the phrase I come back to a lot because I know sometimes when we talk about a diagnosis, that line pops up. It's just a label. People just use labels as excuses. And yes, I think sometimes people can lean too hard into anything, and that's literally true of anything on earth. But that doesn't mean the answer is to throw out understanding. That's ridiculous. Okay. A diagnosis is not an excuse, it's an explanation. It explains patterns, it explains why certain things feel disproportionately hard. It explains why someone might have spent years like they were failing at life despite being caring, intelligent, and very much not useless. And it explains why we keep hitting the same wall over and over again. And explanation matters because explanation creates better strategy. So excuse says, well, nothing can be done. Whereas the explanation says, right, okay, and now I know what I'm dealing with. And it's a very different energy. I'm not interested in using labels to lower the bar to the floor. I'm not interested in this learned helplessness dressed up as self-awareness either. But I am deeply interested in helping people understand themselves, because when you understand the real issue, you stop solving the wrong problem. And that is what so many people have been doing for years. They try to fix motivation when the issue is executive function. They try to fix behavior when the issue is regulation. They try to fix confidence when the issue is years and years of shame. They try to fix organization with another pretty notebook, or another pretty diary, or a planner and a set of highlighters, like me, ADHD, all again, no idea. But the actual issue is that an ADHD brain laughs at the face of linear systems. So when you have explanation, you can get to the actual root. And that's why it matters. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times here about late diagnosed women as well, and that moment everything clicks. So for those who are following me on various social media channels, you'll know that later on this year, I'm curating a book called ADHD Hair, The Truth That Took Too Long. So please do subscribe and follow along, because we will be talking about that book as and when it is published. And it is going to be a collection or an anthology written by different women who have a late diagnosis of ADHD. So many women have spent years, decades being told or silently believing that they are too much. They're emotional, they're inconsistent, messy, chaotic, lazy, disorganized, flaky, forgetful, bad with money, bad with time, sensitive, dramatic, basically like failing at being an adult. and then they get diagnosed, they get that label, and then everything clicks. It's not like, oh my God, all my problems are solved and now I alphabetize my spice rack for fun kind of click. Not that way, but it gives context. A friend of mine, a very, very good friend of mine, was very much against, I wouldn't say against, but very much don't really want a label. And I'd suspected for a long time she had ADHD, raging ADHD. And that's okay, because I do too. And we had this discussion about labels and this discussion about, why it's important sometimes to understand what's going on in your brain. And she didn't want this label. Then she got diagnosed very recently, and it was like someone had finally handed her like a missing page. And the things that she'd maybe criticized herself for suddenly sat in a different frame. Patterns made sense, emotional responses made sense, asking made sense. And also pivoting made sense. One thing that I do as an ADHD woman, as an entrepreneur, is that I pivot. I will launch something and then I'll have a go at it for 6 months and I'll be like, no, I'm not going to continue that. Or I'll start a new hobby. You can't see, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see all the pretty pink and the crazy images in the background, which some of them I create with AI. That's my productive procrastination. But over in my office to my right, I have a whole section of things that I haven't touched for about 8 months. I decided I wanted to start watercolor painting. And again, all the game and no idea. It's all over there. So that pivoting, or people calling me flaky, that's fine, but it makes sense. And it's okay to be flaky. It's okay to start something and not want to continue it. But for a lot of women, all of this is huge because they've not just been struggling with ADHD or autism or another neurodivergent condition. What they've been struggling with is the story that they've told themselves about what that struggle meant. So again, you're flaky, you're failing, you're not capable, you need to get a grip. And I always say the conversations that we have with ourselves are the most important. And that internal narrative is brutal. So when a diagnosis comes in and says, actually, this isn't random, there's a reason for this, this could be incredibly validating. So let's not dismiss the idea of a label, but it can sometimes be infuriating as well because there's grief, isn't there? So the years not knowing the why wasn't it picked up, the grief for the opportunities that you might have had with the right support, the grief for the younger version of you, which again, a friend of mine, we talked about, and she grieves a younger version of herself who, thought that she was a problem or might have done something different with the right support. And this is why, again, I get so frustrated with people dismissing labels as being pointless. It was pointless to who? As well, because for the person finally understanding themselves, it's anything but pointless. So let's talk now about learned helplessness, because I want to talk about this. I've alluded to it before. Let's get into that bit that is a little more nuanced, because I do think there can be a downside if labels are handled badly. And one thing I have seen a lot of children say in schools is, I can't do this. I don't know. I won't be able to do this. I can't do this because I've got ADHD, and so on. Almost as if the label is like, right, that's the end of conversation. And I don't like that, because I don't want the label to become a ceiling. All right. I want it to be shorthand for, well, I can't do anything then, so I'll just give up. Okay. Absolutely not. No. But I also think adults are sometimes too quick to call that learned helplessness and move on, because what looks like learned helplessness can sometimes be a nervous system trying to protect itself. It can be the brain going into that survival mode. It can be anxiety. It can be fear of failure. It can be the memory of getting it wrong over and over again, the embarrassment, the overload. It's often a child trying to avoid the feeling that task creates in them. I always say this a lot when I talk about reading. It's a gateway skill. It's so damn important. It's not that the child hates reading, they hate how it makes them feel. And we can work with that. And that's the difference. So a child who says, I can't do this, yes, it might be a bit of learned helplessness, but it might not be. They might not be refusing the task. They're refusing the panic and the shame, or that idea of, I'm going to be exposed and I'll get it wrong and I'll be embarrassed in front of everyone. Because if adults hear I can't and think, oh, here we go again, more excuses, then they will completely miss that emotional truth underneath it. And I'm very guilty of this as an educator. Obviously, I'm not in the classroom educating now. I was in education for 13 years and spent over a decade of it as an English teacher. And I'm very guilty of not understanding the emotional resonance underneath those phrases. But I have to forgive myself, of course, because I do believe I did the best job that I could with the emotional um, load that I had and the workload that I had as a teacher. So if we miss that emotional truth underneath it, we don't say, never mind them, poor you, off you pop. We should be getting curious. We should be thinking, where is the barrier? What's the fear? What feels unsafe? What support is needed? What is making this task feel bigger than it is? And it's our job as adults or educators, at least, to shorten the gap to success, okay, to close that gap between task and progress. But if that child has become so dependent on an adult for help, then it's going to feel more difficult. And there's a hell of a job ahead of you to gain that independence, because that child learns that trying feels dangerous because it's repeatedly ended in shame. And sometimes it's all too easy for the adults around them to just do something for them. But the label shouldn't close the conversation down. It should open it up. It should help us say, right, now I know a little bit more about how this brain works. How can I help, rather than, oh, well, there we go again, case closed. That's the lazy bit. Okay, we're letting ourselves off the hook if we're not curious about how to close that gap. And frankly, I think too many systems are lazy when it comes to neurodivergent people, especially as well when it comes to girls and masking and being missed altogether, because girls, particularly autistic girls and often girls with ADHD, they can be very, very good at masking, sometimes frighteningly good, good enough that their parents and professionals or the people in their lives can miss what's going on entirely. They get that good that they get called shy, anxious, what else? Sensitive, quirky, dramatic, perfectionist, bossy, intense, socially awkward, people pleasing, overachieving, or any number of words that dance around the issue without actually naming it. And again, this is where the label matters. If a girl is masking so brilliantly at school, she's mimicking, she's copying scripts, she's holding it together all day and then falling apart when that mask slips at home, that lack of understanding can be absolutely disastrous, and adults can completely miss what they're seeing. They can think she's fine at school, she's got friends, well, she can make eye contact. Or my favorite is, she's doing well, or she's doing well academically. I was a very academic child. Okay, she can't possibly be autistic. She's too chatty to be autistic, or she's too quiet to have ADHD. She's too bright, she's too calm, she's too this, she's too that. As if neurodivergence has a look, because it doesn't. And I think the girls are missed because people are still working from these very outdated stereotypes. So again, this is one reason that a label or a diagnosis can be important, because they're uncovering what's been hidden in plain sight for so long. They help people stop measuring children against these narrow, very much male-centered, stereotypical ideas of presentation. They help the individual themselves understand why life feels harder than it actually looks from the outside, and that's huge. Okay, because a girl who is missed doesn't stop struggling because the adult fails to spot it. I think she just struggles without the right language, the right support, the right mirror. And very often she's going to turn inward. She might think it's her fault. She's too much. I'm not enough, all at the same time. Too sensitive, too intense, too disorganized, too emotional. And somehow not trying hard enough, not being good enough, not fitting in enough, and it can be absolutely exhausting. So again, I don't see the label as the danger. I see the danger in people refusing to look properly because they're so desperate not to label. So I want to finish about the real issue, because I've waffled on enough. No, actually, I haven't waffled. I've had a nice little rant here, so I'm not gonna put myself down and say I'm waffling. This is very important to me. So what's the real issue then? Let's just go back to the beginning. If the label is not the main problem, what is? In my opinion, guys, it's this. We have attached the wrong meaning to neurodivergent labels for too long. We've had ADHD and thought naughty instead of dysregulated. We've had autism and thought cold instead of overwhelmed. We've had dyslexia and thought unintelligent instead of differently wired for literacy processing. We've had diagnosis and thought limitation instead of information, and that's the issue. And because of that, people are frightened of labels when actually they should be frightened of the lack of understanding around the labels. Because a label in the hands of somebody informed can actually be useful. A label in the hands of somebody thoughtful can be liberating. A label in the hands of someone supportive can be the beginning of proper advocacy. But yes, a label in the hands of somebody ignorant can be harmful. That part is true, but the answer isn't to avoid labels altogether. It's let's get better informed. And that's the actual work, because I would much rather live in a world where we say, yeah, that child has ADHD. Let's understand what that actually means. Or yes, this young person is autistic. Let's listen and adapt accordingly. Or yes, this adult has a diagnosis. Let's stop expecting them to function as if they don't, rather than no labels, please. Let's just keep misunderstanding everybody equally. Okay? It's vague, it's not progressive, and it doesn't help anybody. So what should we do with labels instead? If we're going to use labels, what should we do? We should use them to help us understand patterns, reduce shame. When it comes to being neurodivergent, there are so many shame-based mental health risks, especially in childhood. Think about what that impact is going to have, not only on their day-to-day life in school. And let's face it, we're just churning kids out through an exam factory now. I'm not, I'm not convinced that every single person making decisions at government level wants our children to be happy, but that's probably for another podcast. Okay. But if they're not happy, they're not going to learn. Okay. So our number one priority for our children is their well-being and their happiness, not how can we make them feel more shame. Okay. So we use patterns to reduce that shame, build that self-awareness, improve communication, access support, adapt environments for them, identify their strengths. It's not about what's wrong with me, it's about what's strong with me. How can we leverage the neurodivergent brain? If I didn't have ADHD, would I be an entrepreneur? I don't know. Okay, there's a lot of research that points to around, I think the statistic is at 29 or 30% of entrepreneurs have ADHD. Okay, we're non-conformists. We don't colour within the lines. Well, I do, because it gets on my nerves when I colour outside the lines. I like things to be neat. But metaphorically speaking, I don't toe the party line. I'm a little bit of a rebel. I really am. But is that a good thing? I mean, I was a very good kid in school, but outside of school, I was drinking in the park and getting suspended. Go figure. But we identify the strengths: entrepreneurial, spontaneous, think outside the box, good at problem solving, good at decision making. Is impulsivity always a bad thing? Okay, there are lots of strengths to a neurodivergent brain, but we should also use patterns to advocate effectively and stop making character judgments about neurological differences. That is what labels should do. They're a starting point. They should say, great, we know more, so now we need to be responsible enough to do better. Not, oh, well, that's that then, and just that's it. Okay. And I think for parents especially, that shift is important, because I know the instinct can be, I don't want my child to be labeled, but sometimes what a child needs is for somebody to finally say, you're not lazy, you're not bad, you're not weird, you're not broken, you're not stupid. Your brain just works differently. And that means we need to understand it properly. And that is powerful. And for adults, it can be just as powerful as well, to realize, actually, yeah, I'm not a failing human being. I've been trying to navigate the world without the right map. All I need now is the right map and the right people and the right tools. And that's what labels can give people. A map, not a prison, a map. Now, can some people try to shove you in a box with that label? Yes, of course they can. People love a box. Society is absolutely obsessed with categories and boxes. But the answer is not to reject the understanding. The answer is to reject the rubbish assumptions that come with it so often. So yeah, that's the difference. Anyway, bottom line, let me be really clear. I don't think labels are the enemy. I think stigma, ignorance, low expectations, lazy thinking is the enemy. But a label used well can be absolutely life-changing. And that's where I stand. And honestly, I think more people need to be saying this. I'm anti-B. I'm not anti-label. I'm anti-BS, anti-shame, anti-stigma, anti-reducing people to stereotypes, and anti-making neurodivergent people feel like they're the problem, okay, when they're not. All right, it's a mismatch between them and the environment. So If this episode hit home for you, if it made you think, if it made you want to send it to one person who says things like, oh, we didn't have ADHD in my day, please do. Get them on a Zoom with me. But make sure you subscribe to the Inclusive Teacher Co podcast so you don't miss future episodes. Leave a comment, leave a review, share it with someone, because that helps more parents, it helps more educators, it helps more neurodivergent individuals actually find this podcast amongst all the other very helpful ones out there. And it helps push useful conversations further rather than the usual recycled rubbish. And of course, if you're looking for more training or support or input around neurodiversity, literacy, inclusion, and what this all looks like in the real world rather than in glossy policy nobody actually uses, you can connect with me through the Inclusive Teacher Co. So I'm going to end with, use the label to understand the person, not shrink them. I will see you in the next one. Thanks, guys.